final panel of the day today will be competition and collaboration with China for leadership in innovation. Please welcome panelists Dean Garfield, Tom Linebarger, Mark Warner, Gary Locke, and moderator Denise Young.
We lost everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Did we just lose the whole crowd?
Good afternoon, everyone. So today we've talked a lot about American innovation. We've talked a lot about what we're currently doing as a country and what we need to be doing better to sustain our competitive edge. We're going to switch gears in this panel and talk about how China is pursuing innovation and what that means for the United States. So this panel obviously needs no introduction here in Washington, D.C., but just so you guys understand the caliber of folks we have here, I'm going to briefly introduce folks. Gary Locke, Governor of Washington State, also former ambassador to China and Secretary of Commerce. Senator Mark Warner, Vice Chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, former Governor of Virginia, and also successful businessman before he entered politics. Tom Linebarger, who is the CEO and Chairman of Cummins. It's the largest independent diesel engine company in the world. He is also the chair of the Business Roundtable International Engagement Committee, which handles all of the work on trade. And Dean Garfield, who is president and CEO of ITI, an important voice representing the technology industry here on this panel, especially since the tech industry is often in the crosshairs of the trade dispute going on between US and China.
Yes, we are.
So I also want to remind folks in the audience here that you are able to ask questions of our panelists by going to askbrt.org, and I will be receiving them here on this iPad. Let me begin with you, Governor Locke. So you've seen China from many different vantage points, having served as ambassador from the Secretary of Commerce and also as governor of Washington. Over the last 2 decades, China has gone through a tremendous transformation. In 2001, when they first entered the WTO, it was really a different country, a different economy. Now they are the second largest economy in the world. So can you just briefly sort of walk us through the evolution of China during the last 2 decades and the U.S. relation, the U.S. economic political relationship during that time?
Well, since President Nixon's visit to China, or even President Carter's reestablishment of diplomatic relations 40 years ago this month, we've seen the most dramatic transformation the world has ever seen, social economic transformation, where 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty, and you have now 18,000 miles of high-speed rail built in just the last 10 years alone, skyscrapers with lobbies of Grand Hyatts on the 54th floor, and the list goes on, and so many Chinese companies that are now preeminent positions throughout the world. China is America's largest export destination outside of North America, and America is China's largest export destination, with exports to America exceeding exports to all of the EU countries combined. So China is really trying to reassert itself, reestablish its glorious past and its history. They believe they have been shamed and been stunted over the last several hundred years, and they're trying to reestablish themselves. And so our economies are so intertwined, but also they've long known that as they try to move from a subsistence farming, as they have gone to low-cost, low-wage, export-driven manufacturing, just as we have said that their future, and as they've looked at Japan and Taiwan and Mexico and Hong Kong, that their future is really in innovation as they move up the economic food chain, and that low-cost manufacturing will go to other places. So now they're really focusing on innovation, which creates the huge concern that we have here in America, whether it's security, whether it's intellectual property, whether it's dominance and leadership in our own high-tech innovation industries.
Well, President Xi has made abundantly clear that innovation in key strategic technology areas is a huge focus for the Chinese government. Senator Warner, to what degree do you think China's aspirations to become the leader globally in innovation underpins the kind of tension that exists between the US and China right now on the economic front and on the political and security front as well.
Well, there has been obviously some ongoing trade tension with the rise of China. And echoing what Gary just said, I mean, China's ascendancy is remarkable. I mean, you think about the notion it was 15, 20 years ago, roughly about a $2 trillion economy. Now it's closer to 15 trillion. And there's never been a country that's had this kind of remarkable development. In the innovation space, my concern has been three or fourfold. One, I still believe a lot of that innovation, at least the kind of base innovation, has come through intellectual property theft. Some of that through cyber, and part of that is a reflection of the fact that for the last 20 plus years, under now 3 administrations, we've had very little of a cyber doctrine in terms of how we would respond to near-peer adversaries like Russia and China, and they have been able to kind of almost steal with impunity. Secondly, my concern, again, more on the tech side, has been the number of American companies that in the rush to get access to the 1.4 billion people in China, the largest market around, that they've been willing to make sacrifices to get into that market that companies, not just American, but Western companies writ large, would not make to go into any other market in the world, and consequently have allowed shared development deals, transfer of technology that a company would not make breaking into India or breaking into the EU or anywhere else in the world. Third, and this is the part, and this is where Governor Locke and I have been friends for a long time, was sharing some of the concerns backstage. You know, I still believe at one level, yes, these two great economies, these two great societies, we need to find a way to work together and coexist. But my kind of notional idea that simply expansion of China, particularly on the technology front alone, was going to mean a closer collaboration I think is more frayed at this point. I think starting in 2015, in particular, as President Xi consolidated power, and I think President Xi is a different kind of leader in China than we've seen in the last 50 years, I think, as much concentration of power as Mao, potentially even more. But what we've seen with President Xi's consolidation is a real investment in next generation technology, 5G technology, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. And China is making the level of intellectual investment in these areas that is rapidly approaching passing the United States. And I think many of the Chinese, some of the great success Chinese companies, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, I fear that they are, when push comes to shove, they will share their data, information, basic heart and soul with the Chinese government. I think the intelligence community across the board, has reached this consensus opinion. One of the things I'm trying to do is find ways to get some of that information declassified so we can share this information with the business community in a broader way. And one just last point about some of the challenge that we face. I think about this from a defense standpoint. America just passed a defense budget of $716 billion, largest in the world. I worry at times that we are buying in that defense budget a lot of 20th century stuff in terms of planes, tanks, guns, ships. Russia's got a defense budget of 70 billion. China's roughly 200-ish, depending on how you look at it. And I think a lot of the conflict in the 21st century will be in the realm of cyber and misinformation, disinformation, areas where Russia and China are already our peers. And the delta between what we are spending on defense and China is actually investing in artificial intelligence, in next generation wireless 5G, in quantum computing, in a host of other areas where their goal, and they've articulated quite well, is not simply to be co-equal with the West, but to lead by 2025. And that is could be a good outcome or could be a very challenging outcome.
I want to pick up on two things you talked about, which is forced technology transfer, IP theft, cyber attack, and turn to Tom to ask you to talk about this, because I know that China is a growing market for your industry. It's increasingly difficult for you to do business there. To what degree are these types of requirements just to gain access to the China market creating really sort of an untenable situation for your industry, and how you're dealing with it?
Well,
Thanks for that, Denise. We started as an innovation-driven entrepreneurship company. It's just that we started 100 years ago. So we are essentially the startup, but it was so long ago that we're celebrating our 100th anniversary next year, so that's why I had to brag on that for just a second. But China played a major role in Cummins' innovation and growth into the size company we are today. We had a very difficult time in the 1990s meeting the requirements of the Clean Air Act. We lived in a cyclical market in the U.S. where most of our market was selling to truck companies in the U.S. and it was up and down. And frankly, I don't think we'd be here if that was really our principal market alone today. So we were able to take technologies we developed to meet the Clean Air Act and go to China and basically provide engines there that were new technology that would help them address emissions problems they were having in China. And we grew our sales of engines a lot, which helped us invest in more technology in the US. So today we sell about 1.3 million engines globally. 500,000 of those are in China, just to give you a sense. So it's a big market for us. And it's not just big in the sense that, well, it's a lot of volume. It allows us to increase our R&D investment that we spread across all the technology we do. We are a major investor in electric powertrains today for commercial vehicles. Again, we are using volumes and other things we have in China to help fund that. It is challenging to do business in China. The things that you mentioned, most of our companies, most of the industries we participate in, we have to do through a joint venture. We cannot have a retail and service infrastructure except through a joint venture. There's a bunch of requirements that I don't know if we would do them in other markets, but we have to do them in China or we don't get to participate. It's not fair. That's not a level playing field. It definitely is not. I think it was set up when they were a developing country and it stays there, and that's not right. It should be changed. I think, but we have figured out a way to succeed in that country, even with all those barriers, in a way that's bettered Cummins, increased employment in the US, bettered our technology, improved our innovative capacity. So I would just say that all the challenges and struggles we've faced there have strengthened our company, not weakened it. Yeah. Would I like it to be more level? Yes, I would. Would I like to fix all those problems? Yes, I would. Would I like to see our prints not be stolen? Yes, I would. But I'd rather participate in the market with all those challenges than be blocked out.
Sure. I was just in China a couple weeks ago, and we talked about tech transfer issues there. And what's apparent to me is that during a period of China's growth, they did depend on tech transfer from US companies to innovate, to develop some capacity. Now they're trying to go on their own. They're making massive investments into R&D. They're directly subsidizing some strategic industries. They are training a workforce, building a truly world-class education system. They're trying to, at least, to compete with the United States. So Dean, I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what are the most challenging aspects of China's approach to innovation right now for your industry in particular?
I think it's actually what Senator Warner laid out, as well as what Tom pointed to, which is both sides of the coin. So Senator Warner laid out all of the challenges of competing in China, and the reality is it's hard to say that you're a global company while ignoring a fifth of the world's population. And so given that interdependence, how do we deal with the inflection point that we face today? And I think putting pressure on China to create a market that is more free or open and reciprocal is the way to do that. I think aspiring to drive structural change in China and to suggest that China is going to move away from being an experiment between capitalism and communism is overly ambitious. And so for the companies that we represent, the goal is really to get China to keep the commitments that they made when they joined the WTO and not abuse the privilege of being a part of that organization.
And how's
I'd like to add on that.
Well, it's not going very well, and that's why the point that Mark made earlier, Senator Warner made about the need for greater sharing of information and insight between the administration and the private sector and driving in a way that is bidirectional and symbiotic will be more helpful than what we've had historically.
I think part of the key problem, the fundamental problem, is the fact that in China, so many sectors of the Chinese economy are off limits to foreign investment, whether American or European or Western investment. And where investment is allowed, oftentimes it cannot be more than 49.9%, and therefore you have to have a partnership. And even if you, and then as Tom was indicating, and so many requirements of a joint venture. And when you have a joint venture, you're going to have to share your technology. You have to be very, very careful. I really think that, and these complaints are not just by American companies, but really foreign companies, Western companies. And I really think that the West should join together to impose the similar restrictions on Chinese companies doing business all around the world. I mean, if Microsoft and Amazon, in order to do business in China, must have a Chinese partner, then why isn't Alibaba or the other, Baidu and other Chinese companies required to have a partnership in America or anywhere else in the country? I really think that America needs to really work with our allies to impose tough conditions on China to force them to really live up to their commitments when they join the WTO.
And I would add, I think there was, again, because I would argue, again, there's a lot of literature, and part of this also needs to be, the intelligence community needs to be more forward-leaning so we can convince business leaders and others about the challenge. You know, I think there was a growing international recognition post-2015 through 2017 that there was both the consolidation of power by Xi, the reemergence of the role in a much more significant way of the Communist Party, and I think the notion that some businesses operating in China think that the companies are operating in a real market-based economy. At the end of the day, most of these companies are not responsible to their shareholders or their board of directors. They're responsible to the Communist Party, and that is just a price of doing business that people need to be aware of. And echoing what Gary said, I think there was this moment, you know, and I would argue that some of this could have been started under the last administration under President Obama, but with the beginnings of President Trump, to build this kind of global coalition, not anti-China, but to say, you have enjoyed the benefits of the WTO. You cannot, as a country now that is second largest economy, soon to be first, and in areas from patents issued to scientific publications made to investment in key areas of technology, you are number one or number two in most of these areas. You got to operate by the common set of rules. Instead, we've taken, and this is where I disagree with the trade policy of this administration, we've gone out and called Canada a national security risk under Section 232, and we've engaged in a battle on China around aluminum and steel, or about the need to try to purchase more agricultural products, key parts. My fear is the administration may give away the farm figuratively in terms of getting additional agricultural products and surrender the opportunity to actually take on where 21st century economy is going to be headed in technology and in innovation in areas like artificial intelligence, 5G, quantum, biotechnology. They've already the leader in facial recognition. And in many of these areas, because of just the size of their population, the enormous investments they've made, the innovativeness of their economy, and the ability to share data across all of these so-called private companies may put us and frankly the West so far behind that you never catch up.
Yeah, we certainly had that worry early on. To give the administration credit where they deserve it, you've seen a progression away from simply focusing on the trade deficit to focusing on how do you create a more fair, open, and equitable market in the ways that we are all talking about, looking at the ways in which, and the commitments that have been made that have not been kept. And so I think one of the things that's important for us to do in both the public and the private sector is to continue to reinforce the importance of the goals, to continue to reinforce what the strategy is here and what we really want to achieve with China. I think all too often the focus is on things that are in some respects a distraction. So why are we criticizing China for having a long-term plan? It seems to me that there's nothing wrong with China having a long-term plan. What's important is the United States and other markets having a long-term plan in parallel, making sure that that long-term plan doesn't have elements of it that are unfair. So state actors funding in a way that creates a discriminatory marketplace. And so I think we need to hone in on what the goals are here so that we can actually achieve some success.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would say that it's bad for any country to strive to be preeminent or world-class in any sector. Certainly we don't say that's bad of Europe in forming what became Airbus and a rival competitor to our own domestic aviation industry, Boeing, which is commercial airplanes in my hometown of Seattle, Washington. But the question is, how do they do that? And the previous panel in which we had Dennis Muhlenberg and others talking about unfair subsidies by the EU toward Airbus. We need to be very concerned about any unfair advantages or support that the Chinese government gives to all of these emerging industries, whether it's AI, supercomputers, quantum computing, et cetera, or electric vehicles. It's great that they have those aspirations, but it's not enough just for America to criticize how they do it and whether the support for those industries is counter to international rules. But what are we doing as a country to respond to maintain our preeminence in those fields? The National Science Board actually indicates that perhaps by the end of this year or within the next year, total R&D spending by the government of China and the private sector and all their businesses will exceed that of America. And from the previous panels, we heard about the role of DARPA and various government funding, whether it was to Qualcomm, some of the early stage activity of many of our companies in Silicon Valley. What are we doing now? I mean, the defense budget is at all-time high, but spending for DARPA...
Domestic discretionary spending is at an all-time low.
Right.
And
National Science Foundation, when you adjust it for inflation, it's all-time low. DARPA funding is relatively flat. China, with only 4 times the population of America, has 8 times the number of graduates every year in STEM fields, and they're putting out massive outlays of money to entice the world's preeminent scientists to set up R&D facilities in China. And we were hearing from the earlier panel about the great adventures in space by Boeing and many other companies to actually have people on the moon, to have a mission to Mars. We really need another almost Apollo project that we had 60 years ago.
But as you know, and again, not to segue over to kind of the budget battles, but right now, for every dollar you send here to Washington, about 7 cents on the non-defense side goes into education, infrastructure, and R&D. I was a venture capitalist longer than I've been a politician. I would never invest in an enterprise that spent less than 7% of its revenues on its workforce, plant and equipment, and staying ahead of the competition. That is a bad business plan for our country. So, and unfortunately, the administration is talking about even cutting domestic discretionary more on a going forward basis. So I agree, we do need this longer term plan, but we need also at least some immediate tactical challenges because, again, I used to be a telecom guy. The 5G standards will be set in 2019. And we grew up in a world where there was always Western equipment that dominated those markets, where now Huawei and ZTE, supported by China Telecom, though that debate about who's going to set the standards, and even if America and our best allies remain with Western equipment, if the balance of the world is driven with Chinese-based equipment that has been certified by our national security community as being a national security threat, that is not a long-term good outcome for our country, or for that matter, for the West.
So when you think about competition between US and China for innovation, right, it's about competing on these sorts of metrics and indicators, of course, but it's also a competition of sort of governance models, right? A top-down directed approach to innovation where the government can seed massive amounts of funding, can direct resources, can tell companies what to do. And then in our approach here in the United States, which is a market-based approach, where, frankly, long-term funding from Congress is hard to obtain. So Tom, turning to you on this, understanding these constraints, what can the US government do here? I mean, you're talking to the USTR, all the time. You're a businessman, but you're also a trade expert, I understand. So what kind of rules and commitments do you think we can we should be pursuing with regard to China?
So one thing I was thinking about, I was talking with Dean backstage, I was thinking to myself that our biggest opportunity to impact China from a trade and security point of view was TPP, and we missed it, and how disappointing that was.
And TPP should have been sold not only as a trade deal, but a national security deal.
And how hard I sold it as both and still lost. But anyway.
But I was still for it.
You were for it, but I lost. So I guess.
But you also noticed that many elements of the TPP were incorporated into the recent revisions
They were.
Of NAFTA.
But I think that, because it goes to the question you asked, this question of TPP, because what we have essentially is two completely different systems with different sets of rules. And so as a international company, you're essentially showing up to the playing field with a different set of rules and figuring out how you can compete. And as Dean said, if you don't compete, you've now missed a gigantic, I mean, the biggest market for trucks anyway, 3 times the US. It's the biggest market in the world by far. You're out. And that means your volume is down by a lot, your ability to spend money on R&D is way down. So you want to find a way to compete, but you have to show up with a different strategy and a different team. But our competition in electrified power, I think, is instructive in why, just because everything is so centrally planned and subsidized, it doesn't necessarily mean a win for China. In electrified vehicles, for example, China has been subsidizing heavily the electrified cars and buses and commercial vehicles that I participate in. And they have, I mean, I would say 9 of every 10, at least commercial vehicles, electric vehicles sold, has been sold in China. 9 of every 10. And that's because there's just so much subsidy in the market. But if I look at the electric vehicles that are going to win long run, that are going to actually replace diesel or gasoline or natural gas vehicles, the ones that are being produced in China aren't going to win. And the reason is they don't have to compete. They essentially, they are made to get the subsidy. And because the companies producing them are essentially trying to meet the government's requirement to say, I will have so many new energy vehicles by the end of this quarter or at the end of this year. And again, it's not that they aren't learning things, because they are. They're investing, they're learning, but they aren't at the edge of competition. They don't feel the knife every day. Like, if I don't beat this, I don't get to sell one.
That's absolutely right.
And so when we have to sell one, if it doesn't win, if it doesn't beat the things that are out there, we can't sell any, 0. And what's more, we have to figure out how to do it with our current R&D budget, with our, with all the constraints of the capital markets. We may not win, but if we do, we will be lean and mean and tough.
Well,
And we will beat them. So what I'm thinking to myself is both strategies can work. A subsidy strategy, especially in the early years, to get people investing and moving. But just remember that Chinese companies have all these government requirements to meet. They have to go to meetings of the government all the time and be told how to say things and how to do things. They have to invest in stuff that makes no sense, and they're doing all. And we don't have to do any of those things. I can go to a meeting with Senator Warner if I want to, and I don't have to if I don't want to. I can still.
you obviously don't know Senator Warner.
Exactly. There's some meetings I do need to go, and that's a good point. He does have subpoena power. But beyond that, the point is I get to operate to optimize for the efficiency and effectiveness of our company and our technology. That is a massive advantage that we enjoy. And we should not underestimate that in competition. It is a really big advantage.
But I just want to make one quick point.
Yes, sir.
Chris. I think you're right. I think we've still got that secret sauce around innovation. But if you just take the electric vehicles for a moment, if Cummins defines a slightly better way on a design piece, what I worry about is you may get the ultimate design, but are all the component parts going to be still made in China?
Well, say why that is bad, because part of the innovation that occurred here by Ford some 60 years ago, or actually longer now, was the idea of differentiated value. And so if China can do some subcomponent better that doesn't undermine the national security of the United States, why is that bad? We are 3 years into the Chinese 10-year plan, where they outlined in Manufacturing 2025 4 areas of technology that they wanted to focus on. They are not leading after 3 years in any of those areas. None, 0. And so I think as long as we can keep the notion of open, fair, equitable, then companies like Cummins will win every time. I think where we have to worry, Senator Warner, is where we lose that, whether through national security or other means, where they're able to compete fairly and steal from the United States or steal from global companies generally.
If your basic startup costs are smaller because you've not invested in all that R&D, but you've acquired the base technology through either a cyber theft or through a forced tech transfer, or what the Chinese have done very smart in terms of early stage investing in American startups. The amount of AI investment that China made 2 years back passed the lines crossed in terms of China into US versus North America into all of China. Then their cost of startup is much lower, and then you supplement that with tremendous incentives and government policy subsidies. It really does mean
I agree with you.
that our enterprises start at an enormous disadvantage. And all I'm saying is, let's have this market, but let's have it be an actual free and open market, not what's pretending to be right now.
We're in adamant agreement. I think the only thing that I'm pushing back on, and perhaps even slightly respectfully, is defining the problem with sufficient clarity so we can develop a strategy and solutions that will actually work.
Right.
And so if we are broad in our definition of the problem with regard to China, the solution we develop will likely be quite broad and miss actually driving to a solution that will help the country both economically and on the national security front.
And also, I think we need to be careful to think that innovation is like a secret recipe or a line of code or something like that. At least I can't speak for other industries. I can just speak for ours, and that isn't how innovation occurs in our industry. It's very iterative. You are essentially producing product after product after product and moving ahead technology. So we today still get regularly people steal prints. There's actually, you can go on and get Cummins engine prints on the web in China, and there's a price for each one. I kind of feel proud when it's expensive. It's unfortunately only like $300 or $400 to buy one, but you can buy a print and you could print it up. And we actually compete in the aftermarket with products that take a version of our name and they manipulate the name and they sell the product. And it is theoretically the same dimensions, but it actually doesn't work. And so I do think that innovation is not as simple as a recipe. I do agree with what you said, that you can get a head start, but we are when we're talking about competing to win at the edge of these new technologies, the learning process, the edge of competition matters.
But I would only,
you need it in order to become a long-run innovator.
I think there are many on the American business enterprise and others that have almost a kind of yesterday's mindset view. Well, yes, if China or others steal, it will simply be duplicative. And the message I want to convey is, particularly in the last 3 to 4 years, the quality of innovation in China has risen exponentially.
Yeah, definitely
no
true.
doubt.
And even though you may say, well, their patents aren't the same as our patents. Well, are they getting better? Absolutely.
They are.
Their research isn't as good. Is it getting better? Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just the sheer force, and to Gary's point earlier, China does have a plan. They've got an articulated industrial plan that, candidly, I wish we would have more of in this country.
So, in the spirit of democracy and free markets, I have to take some questions from the audience. And there's a question that's actually directly related to your point, Senator Warner. When you look at China's approach to innovation, what are they doing better than the US? And is there anything that we can learn from China? Who wants to answer that?
No, I would argue we can learn from the fact that the China 2025 program that President Xi's outlined has, I think, as well as anything I've seen in the world, articulated those industries that are going to be defining forces of how we live and how we interact in the 21st century. We could even borrow some of that blueprint, but it's going to require a level of governmental investment. And candidly, if you look at private sector R&D, And there are exceptions like your enterprise and others. But if you look at it at the macro level, we're declining as a nation on our R&D on the private sector side as well. So we both have to pick our areas of expertise, or pick our areas. I think we could maybe borrow some from China, but also find ways to incent from both tax code basis and encouragement. And frankly, part of that goes into the whole notion of, can we turn our capital markets back towards long-term value creation over the constant pressure on short-term quarterly results only, because you've got pressures that you wouldn't have had 50 years ago, just even within the private sector in terms of R&D.
Yeah, building on that, I think the notion of mobilizing an all-in national effort around frontier innovations. So a year and a half ago, China decided that AI was a national priority. And the result of that was not only investment from the government, but there were 14 different municipalities in China that decided they were going to create AI frontier innovation zones. And so the notion of creating national imperatives, like getting to the moon, is something that I think they do well, that we can certainly relearn.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. And Dean, you took the phrase out of my mouth. I really think that just as we said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. John F. Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s. We need to have that type of moonshot commitment in a variety of different sectors and industries that are, and technologies of the future, whether it's going to be energy efficiency, clean energy, whether it's in biotechnology, whether it's in AI, supercomputers, quantum computing, quantum encryption, and the list goes on and on. We need to have a moonshot goal in a variety of different areas and look at the partnership that government and private sector and universities can play, providing that impetus and that coordination.
I guess we should give the BRT.
Part of that is also
you go.
is
Sorry.
kind of America getting its mojo back. Who has not been to China? And it's been a while for me, but I just remember when I was there riding on the high-speed rail to the airport in Shanghai and saying, oh my God, isn't this great? And everybody says, well, of course we can never do it in America. That is the antithesis of what was great about our country for so long,
and
that notion of can do. And we do need, and this is where, where the governmental sector has to be better in terms of, if there are areas of national priority, there needs to be, whether it's licensing or approval process, in an expedited process, so that even if we can find the dollars, it doesn't take us 20 years to get a project done.
Yeah, Gary, I think the difference between John F. Kennedy's invitation and invocation and now is the need for the public and the private sector to do it together.
Yep.
And that's where BRT's effort around today and more broadly is particularly important, and having conversations like this that include both is critical.
I wanted to add something controversial, which is that I think what I notice in China is that the government and the government leaders feel accountable for economic growth. They feel like if they don't deliver economic growth, they eventually don't stay in power. And I think it's not, in other words, it's not just up to the private sector on their own, and this may be following up on your point. The public sector feels accountable for delivering growth and well-being to the citizens of the country, down to where if we aren't doing it, we have to change plans. We're not going to sit and argue. We're going to get, if it's STEM investment, whatever, we have to have infrastructure, we have to have growth. And I do think that as a public sector and a private sector, we have to commit, as Jamie said earlier today, we have to commit to increasing the growth rate and bringing more people up in this world, so there isn't this difference of like it's a great America for some people and not a great America for others. If people aren't winning, they're not happy. And I just think that the Chinese government feels accountable for that.
Yeah.
And that would be something that we should be trying to emulate here in this country, I think.
Back to you, Senator Warner.
Well, I would, some level I agree. On the other level, there are, just as when we had our enormous spurts of growth and only after the fact realized that we didn't factor in some of the external cost. I mean, there is, massive challenges in China. There's challenges as people move from the west to the east. Gary talks about the 800 million people that have been taken out of poverty. There are still hundreds of millions of folks who are concerned about, the migratory areas, the enormous environmental costs that take place in China.
Yep.
Candidly, the lack of any kind of personal freedom and sense of democracy are are not things that I think I'm ready to trade away.
I would not trade either. Don't
But,
trade.
but we do need this collaborative sense that, quite frankly, does not exist the way it should in this country at this point.
So, as we all know, I think many here in Washington are waiting on the edge of their seats, waiting to see what happens at the end of the 90-day truce between U.S. and China and our ongoing trade war. What do you, and this is the last question, I'd love to hear from all of you. What do you think should be the U.S. approach going into this 90-day period? You know, what should we be putting on the table? What should we be asking for? How can we position ourselves to have the most leverage during this time?
Do you want to just go down the line?
Go down the line.
I would say, I would hope that there would be a high degree of clarity and singularity of message and commitment. I think the law enforcement activities of last evening certainly complicate the likelihood of success, but I remain optimistic if we're clear about the problem as well as the solution and strategy we're driving towards.
I think for me, that we should be thinking about pragmatic market access. I think this, you've heard this from everyone. Like, what are our goals in the near term, this 90-day term? What can we do to increase practical market access for American businesses in China? And what can we get them to practically stop doing that's just unfair practices like stealing IP, et cetera? And what steps would they take in the next, say, 90, 180 days that we would consider good enough that we would move from tariffs and carpet bombing to negotiation? Because I think as soon as we're into negotiation and engagement, the chances for win-win solutions go up. The more we're into tariff and carpet bombing, the more likely we don't get anywhere. So that doesn't mean we can't just walk away with no progress. I just mean, are we clear? What progress do we want? What's good enough? And does it get more market access and solve some of the really key problems we have? I hope we have clarity on our team about that, and I think that's what we should be aiming for.
I fear at the end of 90 days, since the current status of this battle was created by this administration, which tends to create conflict so that then it can claim it solves conflict, that we end up with a short-term conflict win about X dollars of additional, like going back again to agricultural products, and lose the chance to build the kind of international coalition around technology, intellectual property protection, and the focus on where the challenges will really be in the 21st century, from electric vehicles to drones to AI to the list. And again, I'll go back to President Xi's China 2025 list, pretty darn good list to start on. That's where we ought to be looking for victories.
Yeah.
I would hope that the negotiations focus really on the intellectual property transfer of technology issues, not on the trade deficit. So if the Chinese start buying soybeans again, a lot of our agricultural producers are pretty much at maximum capacity anyway, and so is it just to reorder the stuff and go back to the level that it was a year or 2 years ago? Boeing can't build airplanes fast enough. These are long-term orders. So much of our manufacturing capacity is pretty much at full capacity anyway. We don't have enough people to fuel our factories. And so trying to make a really big dent in the trade deficit, I think, is illusory. We need to really focus on the forced technology transfer, the lack of market access, because when you close off sectors in China to foreign participation, foreign investment, and then you say, okay, they can invest in certain areas, but then it has to be with a joint venture partner. That's where the forced technology transfer takes place. I mean, if Cummins wants to share technology, that should be their decision, should not be forced upon them through these requirements of joint ventures. So I think that's the key.
And to Tom's point earlier, China loses in that dynamic as well because they're not facing competition in a way that helps. And so it ends up being a lose-lose instead of the win-win that Tom talked about.
Yes.
I also want to point out what Dean was talking about, the law enforcement action. It was just reported that the CFO of Huawei was arrested in Canada at the request of the United States and is in the process of perhaps being extradited to the United States because Huawei has been alleged to have violated Iran sanctions. I'm very concerned that that's just going to ratchet this trade war and make negotiations much more difficult. Does that mean that if some of the EU countries, because they support the agreement with Iran for Iran to not develop a nuclear weapon, and many people in Europe are openly talking about forming a way in which, a mechanism by which trade could continue with Iran, does that mean that we're going to start arresting CFOs and CEOs and COOs of major corporations in Europe that are doing trade with Iran? So this is a really, I think, a really hot button, almost a grenade with respect to the 90-day negotiations that we're seeing.
And now I'm hearing warnings that American business people should think twice about traveling to China these days, or at least in the near-term future. Well, we've covered a lot of ground on this panel. I think we have our work cut out for us in terms of, you know, the business community, the government, academia, all sort of the key stakeholders working together to make sure that we shore up our own house when it comes to innovation. You know, also at the same time protecting our industry and making sure that they can continue to be competitive in China and elsewhere globally, really. And then finally, you know, this ongoing trade dispute between US and China, we've just got our work cut out for us. So thank you for sharing your insights.
Can I make a brief public announcement? If
Of course.
Senator Warner calls a meeting, I will be attending.
Deal.
Yeah, because there's going to be a subpoena. All right, well, thank you all very much.
I'll come voluntarily.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.